everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be a reading wrap up of the 10 books that I've read most recently. Out of those 10 books, I have 6 of them here physically, which I own, and I read the other 4 on my Kindle. So I'm just going to go from the earliest book that I read to the most recent. Some of them have been featured in my last reading vlog, so I will link that video in the description box if you want to see a little bit more about that. But let's just go ahead and start talking about the books, shall we? So the first book that I read out of this stack was The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead. I picked this book up from Vinted because I thought it was going to be a 5-star. I think I mentioned it in my 5-star prediction video. As you might be able to tell, I have tabbed a little bit of this book, but mainly towards the front rather than later on. And initially I did think this would be a 5-star when I started reading it, but it kind of dwindled off towards the end and I'm giving it a 3-star, I think. So this is a mystery thriller book and we're following this main character called Shay. At the start of this book, she's listening to a podcast which is run by one of her oldest friends. He mentions one of Shay's college friends has just committed suicide, but he thinks that it was a murder. And this is the first that Shay is hearing about any of this. It brings up a lot of trauma for her because when she was in college, her and this friend and another friend were involved in a sex cult, and she thinks that that might have something to do with her suicide / possible murder. So she ends up teaming up with this podcast host to try and figure out what's going on and what happened to her friend. So this book started off really good. I initially really loved the writing. It talked a lot about misogyny, women's experiences, and the patriarchy, and I just loved all the commentary that it had around that. However, I feel like this book possibly isn't the best representation of being in a sex cult. Not that I would know, but it just didn't strike me as very realistic. First off, I didn't really warm to Shay as a character. She is described as being a very beautiful person, and I feel that because of her beauty, she misinterprets a lot of the power dynamics going on around her and believes that she is in control because of how beautiful she is, when in reality a lot of these people were just manipulating her, and I feel like we never really got to the bottom of that in this book. Another really big pet peeve with this book is that Shay and this podcast host are basically trying to infiltrate the sex cult in the present day so that they can reveal all the shady stuff that's going on. And the way that she infiltrates this cult is so easy and convenient. There just never seem to be any consequences for her sneaking into these parties, leaving without doing anything, and being a very obvious plant, I thought. I can't believe that no investigative journalist ever did this before, because the way that she did it was so easy. I also struggled with the past timeline and the believability of it. I did not buy that this man was able to talk 3 feminist university students into joining this sex cult with very little interaction, and I just don't think we got enough of that to make it believable. I'm not saying that that is impossible, I'm just saying that I didn't buy it in this book. I also thought that the podcast element was kind of thrown in just to be a podcast element, and because that's like a buzzword at the minute, I don't think it really added much to the story, and it sounded like the most boring podcast ever, to be honest. If I had to listen to Shay just banging on and on and on about her past, with the podcast host clearly having all these unresolved feelings for her, I just wouldn't enjoy it. So yeah, I thought that that was just a little bit of a pointless part of the book as well. And I also thought that the podcast host himself, who is kind of a love interest in this book, was so wet. I didn't like a lot of his conversations with Shay. She's talking about how she enjoyed beauty pageants when she was younger, and he starts having a go at her, saying like, oh, but that's so beneath you, that's so low. And I just thought that was so like, ugh, annoying man. He doesn't know anything. Like, she acknowledges in that moment that beauty pageants are not obviously very feminist, but she decided to do it because it was a way for her to get a scholarship, and that's just how she harnessed her beauty in that situation, and he was just turning his nose up at it, and I just thought, shut up. So yeah, a lot of this book annoyed me. I might actually move it down to a 2-star because although I liked some of the commentary enough to tab some of it anyway, I thought that the plausibility and the plot and the characters were not very good. I also thought that this book would go really, really dark, and I didn't think it went dark enough. That might just be a personal preference thing, but I've heard that this book is very dark and very disturbing and upsetting, and I didn't think it was that bad. I think it kind of skimmed over a lot of it. So yeah, very unfortunate because I thought that this would be a 5-star rating, and I even got through the first 50 pages thinking it would be a 5-star, so yeah, for it to go that kind of downhill for me is just very unfortunate. But I will probably still read some more of Ashley Winstead's books because I really loved In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. So it's a bit of a shame that this one, which I thought would be totally up my street, was just not the best executed in my opinion. Oh, and another little extra bit is that the ending was a bit stupid, I thought. I liked the decision made by our main character, but then I think it might have been the epilogue or the last chapter, and I just thought that was so stupid and dumb. So yeah, we're definitely putting it down to a 2, and we'll now move on to the next book. So the next book that I read was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I've wanted to read this book for quite a while now. This is a military war fantasy book, and it's part of a trilogy, and obviously R.F. Kuang is like one of the biggest authors at the minute. She's written Yellowface and Babel. So I thought I would dive into the Poppy War trilogy, and I really enjoyed this book. I've given it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. This book is set in the Nakara Empire, which is loosely based on Chinese history, and we're following this main character called Rin, who basically just wants to escape where she lives with her auntie and uncle. Well, they're not really her auntie and uncle, I think she's an orphan, and the only way for her to escape is to pass these exams and basically be given a free pass to the most elite boarding school in the empire. And everyone dismisses her and doesn't think that she'll be able to do it. But anyway, she manages to pass and she gets the best score in her area and is able to go to this school which is called Synagogue. So the first part of this book, we've got those magical fantasy boarding school vibes, which I really enjoyed. So we see Rin get mentored by this very eccentric teacher who is going to try and unlock this power that she's got. But then in a wider context, we've got a lot of politics going on between the Empire and I think it's the Federation, who they've previously been at war with quite a few times, where they had the Poppy War, and tensions are bubbling whilst Rin's at school, and it looks like she's going to have to go to war potentially faster than she can even finish school. This book was really fun. I love Rin as a character so much. She's very powerful and strong, but she also lacks some sort of emotional control, and she's quite spontaneous, very fiery. So I thought she was a really interesting character. She's quite morally grey, and I just really love following alongside her. I loved the world building. I thought that the school scenario was so fun to be in. I'm still a little bit unsure on the magic system. I don't fully understand it, but I think over the course of the books it will become a little bit clearer. I really like all of the political stuff, the war strategy discussions. When I first heard this book was like military focused, I thought that would be super boring, but I'm actually really into it. It's reminding me a little bit of The Hunger Games, where like in the last book, they are discussing all the tactics and propaganda and all that kind of thing. That is very much in here. Well, for me anyway, I don't read a ton of fantasy, so that's the only thing I've got to compare it to. And this book gets very dark, especially I think in the last third. I read a section of it and I almost cried. I had to put it down. It was very upsetting. It is about war at the end of the day and horrible things happen. I did get the second and third books for my birthday off my boyfriend, so I'm definitely going to read those very soon because I don't want to leave too big of a gap. So I'm very excited to continue the series and see how Rin grows as a character and how this world all develops as well. The next book that I read, I listened to on audio, and that was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This is her latest release, and I think I've read every Lisa Jewell that I want to read now except for Watching You. I think that's the one I've got left downstairs. So in this book we're mainly following 2 women. One is called Alex, and she's a podcast host and she makes podcasts about successful women and their stories. And then we're following a woman called Josie, who's a little bit stuck in her life, and she feels kind of unsatisfied. And one night she goes out for her 40th birthday with her husband, and she sees Alex and sees that she's also celebrating her 40th birthday. Josie finds out that Alex is a podcast host and basically convinces Alex to do a podcast about her. And as they're making this podcast, Alex starts getting kind of weird vibes from Josie. Lisa Jewell is one of my favourite thriller authors. I just get so engrossed in her books. I think she writes characters so well so that you're really invested in them. You're interested in their backstories and all their relationships. I just find myself hooked right from the start with every one of her books. I was desperate to find out about Josie's home life and about all the secrets that she's keeping from us. I loved the voice acting, and we're also getting these in-between chapters which are from a Netflix documentary which is basically about these two women, and something bad has obviously happened. There was one where there was a guy walking his dog in the park and you could hear like background noises that made it feel like you were on the park as well. So it was a really well produced audiobook, and I thought it was a really good way to read it, and also with the podcast element it just makes sense as well. I really enjoyed the whole story until we got to the end, which left me feeling a little bit unsatisfied. It was a tiny bit ambiguous and I would have liked a little bit more clarification from it, but other than that I really enjoyed this book. It's not a new favourite from Lisa Jewell, but it's definitely one that I would recommend. Yeah, as always, I look forward to whatever she comes out with next. And if I didn't mention, I've given it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was on my Kindle, and I got it from Kindle Unlimited, and that is At Home with the Horrors by Sammy Scott. This is probably one of my favourite short story collections that I've ever read. It's a collection of short horror stories that all reminded me of Black Mirror. So many of them play with aspects of technology, which obviously is quite Black Mirror-esque. And one of my favourite things about this book is that the ideas are just so scary and so good. Sometimes with short stories I find them to be kind of cryptic, and I didn't think these were cryptic at all. They were very easy to read, very just genuinely frightening. Some of my favourites that I've written down are Teresa, which is kind of grief focused, Blackbird, which I think is similar, Becca, which has one of my scariest tropes in it. I won't say what it is because it's a bit of a spoiler. Catherine, Scared Mary, which was so fun. Scared Mary was basically about a woman called Mary who got pranked by her husband, and he filmed her reaction, and it basically went viral because of how funny she looked when she got scared. And the husband decides to make a business out of this, and he starts his own YouTube channel, and the whole premise is that he's going to scare his wife. So it's all about how that would affect a relationship and about living in fear and what that would do to a person. So really loved that one. And then my favourite one was something else entirely. That was 5-star, my favourite. It literally gave me the creeps. I read it at night and I was too scared to get out of bed. Yeah, it was so good. Again, it had one of my favourite tropes in there. The only problem that I had was that some of them were more like 3 out of 5 stars, 4 out of 5 than 5s. And the last story in the collection, which is a little bit longer, I think it's about 100 pages, it did lose my interest a little bit, but it was still really good overall. So I'm giving this entire collection a 4 out of 5, but I'm definitely going to read more from this author. For me, they've got massive potential to be one of my favourite horror authors, so yeah, I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on what else they bring out. Okay, I've put the exposure up a little bit, so hopefully the lighting is a little bit better. So the next one I read was Penance by Eliza Clark. I have kind of mixed feelings about this book. So this is kind of similar to my favourite book of this year so far, which is True Crime Story by Joseph Knox. This is a retelling of a fictional crime as if it was a true crime book. So we've got this editor, I think his name was Alex. Oh, it's actually Alec. So yeah, basically Alec is writing a definitive account on the murder of a 16-year-old girl called Joan, and the town that it's set in is a fictional town which is meant to be next to Scarborough, which is in the north of England. So all of that I really loved because it felt so similar to towns near me, like Blackpool, Southport, that kind of thing, and you would never know that it wasn't a real town unless you were told, because it just felt so real. And she put so much like fake history in here, and yeah, it just all felt so believable. So basically this 16-year-old girl Joan was murdered by 3 girls that she went to school with. So a lot of this book is following teenage girls, toxic friendships, toxic internet culture, so it talks a lot about Tumblr, and all of that was so interesting. She manages to blend real life fact with the fiction so well, to the point where I was googling stuff wondering if I just didn't know what it was, and no, that was just part of the fiction of this book. And then I think it got to like near the end, and all of a sudden I just wasn't as interested in picking it up. I was finding it quite difficult to read big chunks of it at once, and I don't know if that was just something that was going on in my life, whether I was just tired or whatever, but it took me a little bit longer to finish it than I anticipated at the start because I was so into it. And I think my enjoyment was affected a little bit by the ending, because even though you know from the start that this editor is quite controversial and this account that he's written has been called into question, and I think at the end of the book I'd kind of forgotten that that was the premise, and I fully thought that this was all going to be like fact. So when it got to the end and you're again reminded that this isn't all what it seems, I was really disappointed in it, even though I think that is the point. It did make me think a lot about true crime and how an author can manipulate things and twist things to suit their agenda. And I think it was very interesting and very effective of this book to make me disappointed and frustrated that I didn't know the full facts of this fake case, because I was just wondering which parts of it were real then, what can I believe? But the whole thing's fake anyway, so I don't know why I was so like heated about it. I think it was just very effective in what it set out to do. I've given it a 4 out of 5 stars, but I was so set on it being 5 out of 5 for the longest time. I think it's probably like 4.5 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. I love Eliza Clark. Her writing just speaks to me, and I think speaks to a lot of women my age. So I think if you're in your 20s and you have a similar experience to me with true crime, Tumblr, female friendships, all of that, this book will just resonate with you so much. I highly recommend it, and I'm definitely going to read everything that Eliza Clark comes out with in the future, as I already said when I finished Boy Parts. But yeah, she's just one of my new favourite authors. The next book that I read was a thriller that I've had on my shelf for a very long time, and that was The First Day of Spring by Nancy Tucker. In this book, we're mainly following an 8-year-old child called Chrissy, and in the very first few lines of the book, she murders another child, and we're basically going back and forth in time between Chrissy in the aftermath of this event and Julia 15 years later, who basically is Chrissy grown up with a different identity. Julia now has a 5-year-old daughter called Molly, and she's very paranoid that social services are going to intervene and take Molly away from her because of her past. So I wouldn't say that this book is a thriller, it's more of a crime character study kind of story, but I was really invested in this book. I listened to a lot of it on audio, which was really fun because the voice actors did a really good job. It's very northern, and I just really grew to love Chrissy despite what she does. I think this author made Chrissy feel so real, and you kind of understand what led her to do this based on her experiences with her family and her home life. It's really sad in some parts, but it's also very nostalgic in a way. I thought the way that it described Chrissy's life just playing out all the time with her friends, I think she captures the experience of a child really well in this book, and just reminding me how gross kids can be but also what a kind of happy time it was to just like play out with your friends. So I liked all those aspects of it. I did also like the present day chapters with Julia once Chrissy's grown up, and I think there's a lot of reflection and analysis on her as a character and why she would do what she did and how she's going to deal with that in the aftermath. I think it's just a really well-rounded story about a crime and how it affects everyone around it. I was slightly less interested in the present day, and I always wanted to go back to Chrissy and follow her story. I just found that more interesting. Towards the end, I did lose interest a little bit, and I thought that where it was going was sort of obvious, but I think it did a good job of capturing the psychology of a child killer and the wide-reaching effects of that. So I would definitely recommend it if you're into psychological crime stories and more in-depth character studies rather than a plot-focused book. And I ended up giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And the last 4 books that I'm going to talk about, I also talked about in my last horror reading vlog. So if you've already watched that and you don't want to hear me repeat myself, then that is totally fine. But my opinions might be a little bit more put together now that I've had a few days to think about them. And if you've not watched that video, I will leave it in the description box if you do want to see it. So the first one that I read for that video was Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. And I've ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. This is a horror novel about a character called Claire, who is the team leader for a maintenance team in space. And they've basically just found out that they're all going to be sacked and replaced with robots, and they're on their last adventure together. And on this trip, they end up stumbling across this long-lost spaceship, which was basically designed to look like a luxury cruise liner, I'm guessing Titanic, and it's been lost for I think 15 years or something like that, and it disappeared whilst it was on a year-long trip around the solar system with a lot of high-profile people on board, and no one has ever heard anything from it since. So they've just come across it, they're now going to claim it as a bit of a FU to the people that have just sacked them. However, when they go to the ship, they don't really know what to expect, whether there's going to be loads of dead bodies on board, whether there's going to be any survivors, and then things just go from there. So I was really enjoying this book at first. I really liked the survival aspect of it, and I thought that the whole ship was very creepy. My main issues with this book is that there's quite a heavy focus on a romance between Claire and one of her teammates, or colleagues, whatever, and I just didn't care for that at all, and it was such a big focus of the book. I honestly think that could have just been like completely deleted and I would have enjoyed it more. I also thought it got a little bit less scary once we realised what was happening. I thought that some of it didn't fully make sense, and I thought it could have been wrapped up a little bit quicker than it did. So I've settled on a 3.5 because I was really enjoying it up until about like the 60% mark, when I started getting a little bit annoyed with the romance. Some of the writing was grated on me a little bit, but I still thought it was a fun horror story, and I'm glad that I read it. Next up for that video, I read Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. This was a very surprising 5-star book for me. I read the first 50 pages and I thought that this book was just very odd and I didn't get the point. We're following this character called Wilder, and the first section of this book is basically his summer in this small seaside town, and there's not really any horror whatsoever. And then when we get to page like 80 or so is when it really kicks off and things actually start picking up. I read the majority of this book in one day, which is not like me at all. And although I didn't feel like I was loving the story, I just could not put this book down. The way that it's all been put together is very interesting because we're following different character perspectives. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. There's all of these little chapters that have like brackets for headings and just random words that you don't understand. And then we got to the end and all of a sudden my jaw dropped. I loved it. It gave me the same feeling that The Last House on Needless Street gave me, where it's only when the penny drops that you realise how good of a book it is, how clever the author is. I don't really want to go too much into what this book is about because I feel like you're best off not knowing much, and the blurb is kind of like half the book anyway, so I would just avoid it if possible. But it has some really interesting conversations about who has the right to tell certain stories. The final page of this book gave me actual chills, and I know that sounds very cliche and I never really understand what that means, but it gave me chills, okay? And when I shut this book, I thought, it has to be 5-star. It has to be 5-star. I cannot comprehend the brain power that went into this book. And when I went back and read some of the chapters that didn't make sense at the time, they all suddenly made sense, and I just thought, how does she do it? How does she plot these books? But it was very odd because I felt like I wasn't enjoying it, and then I got to the end and I was like, whoa. You've just blown my mind. So a new favourite. It doesn't feel like something that I would recommend to a lot of people though, because I think it is a little bit odd. I can see why people don't like this one. If you don't like some of the tropes that come up in the end, I can see why you would just think it's a bit silly, but that kind of thing really freaks me out, so I just loved it. The next one that I read was Into the Forest and All the Way Through by Cynthia Palaio, and this is a poetry collection which is basically focused on missing and murdered women in America. I've ended up giving this book a 3 out of 5 stars because I was really enjoying it at the start and I liked all the conversations that I was having in my head, all the thoughts that it was bringing up. But by the end, I thought that the impact of it had lessened a little bit and I was just kind of waiting for it to end at this point. It left me feeling a little bit icky because I've been having all of these thoughts about true crime. If you've watched my videos before, you'll already know. And Penance kind of touches on this as well, about how true crime can be kind of sensationalized. It's also very bingeable, episode after episode, documentary after documentary, that kind of thing. I feel like reading such short, tiny little poems about one woman in particular and then moving straight on to the next one and then straight on to the next one just left me feeling a little bit uncomfortable and like I wasn't really respecting this person's story. So I had to take breaks from it quite often, and I think it's a book that you would read slowly over a long period of time, but that's just not really how I read. I had to consciously slow down, read it over in my head so I wasn't just whizzing through it, which felt kind of unnatural, but I think is the best way to enjoy this book. I'm not really a poetry reader, so I can't really comment on whether it was good poetry or not, but I did notice some of the same sort of poetic effects or whatever you'd call it, poetic techniques coming up time and time again, which took me out of the stories a little bit. But as a whole, I really appreciated how many people's cases it brought my attention to. I noticed that a lot of the poems that I was familiar with were about white women, and that really hit home for me because it really emphasised how many people's stories are not shared enough or not widely known, particularly for Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American people in America. And some of those cases seemed so cut and dry from the poems as if it was really obvious who done it and they were still unsolved. So that made me really upset. And also the cases which featured Jane Doe's as well were so sad. And I think that's the point of this book. It's to raise awareness and to shine a light on all of these cases that are just hidden. And if it was talked about more, then maybe these cases would be solved. Maybe these women would be found and be able to be returned to their friends and family. And it made me think a lot about all the right things, but I also had some conflicting feelings about how short they were. I also did some further research on some of the cases, and I found that the poems kind of reiterated what the Wikipedia page said. So I've got both good and bad feelings towards it, and I'm settling on a 3 out of 5 overall. But if you're interested in that topic and you want to read something that's done in quite a respectful way, and also it would help if you're into poetry already, then this could be a really interesting read for you. And then the last book that I read is The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Mathieu Simard. This is translated from French by Pablo Strauss. This is a book about a couple who basically desperately want to have a baby, and they've moved away from the city to this very isolated town just to get away from everything and focus on just themselves. This town is kind of weird and eerie, and everyone's a little bit standoffish. And there's also this antenna that's been put up in the town which people are a little bit skeptical about, and I don't really want to say much more than that. But I really enjoyed this book. I think I read it very quickly. It is only like 120 pages. It feels very eerie, quite creepy, but I did want it to go a little bit creepier. I wanted it to go a little bit further, but it was very atmospheric. I felt like I could picture this town and these characters very well, and I thought that the relationship between the couple was very odd as well, but they were very interesting to follow. There was a part near the middle where something is revealed, and the way that that section was written was so emotional and heartbreaking, and just all of that build up to the ending was very, very sad, and I loved the ending so much. I thought it was perfect. I've given this book 4 out of 5 stars because I just wanted it to be a smidge more creepy, but as novellas go, I thought this was really, really good. It's an absolutely gorgeous cover. I'm so glad that I own it. And I could see myself reading this again. It just feels weirdly atmospheric, eerie, almost cozy, but it's not meant to be cozy. But I think it would make an interesting reread once you know where it goes. It does have that weird empty feel to it. I don't know, I feel like I could use so many describing words for this book, and I wouldn't be able to capture it fully. I think if you enjoy stories like I Who Have Never Known Men and other slow, strange stories like that leave you thinking a lot and leave you feeling kind of hollowed out as a person, then I think you would really enjoy this one. And that is all the books I have to talk to you about today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books before and what you thought of them. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!